Good afternoon, everybody. Let's get started. I'm Eric Nestler. I'm director of the Friedman Brain Institute, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to this afternoon's webinar on Alzheimer's disease and related dementing illnesses. We knew long before the pandemic that Alzheimer's disease and other dementias represent a challenge to our medical system and society of crisis proportions. It's been estimated, as just one example, that today's entire Medicare budget will be consumed solely for the care of people with dementia within a couple of decades if we don't develop better ways of tackling these illnesses. Here we are, well on the other side of the pandemic. And it's a very nice point to note that we're here in large part because of the spectacular success of science, the development of fabulously effective vaccines, in fact, because of American science and innovation that have brought us to this point. So we feel that this is a great time now to get back to our regular jobs, regular business, and to look once again at Alzheimer's disease and related illnesses. For today's panel, we have 4 experts from Mount Sinai who will tell us about what we've learned regarding Alzheimer's disease and other dementias in the last few years, and the reason for hope that new treatments are on the horizon at long last. I'll be introducing our 4 panelists very quickly. I'll then ask each one in order to give some opening remarks. Then I'll have some questions for the panelists, and then we'll get to the audience questions. We've already received questions from many of you prior to today's program, but if you do have questions, please enter them in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We'll get to as many questions as we possibly can. Joining us today are Georges Nassan, who is professor and vice chair of the Department of Neurology at Mount Sinai, Ana Pereira, who is an assistant professor of neurology and neuroscience at Mount Sinai, Tawfiq Raj, associate professor of neuroscience and genetics and genomic sciences, and Dongming Cai, an associate professor of neurology. Thank you all for joining us today. And we're going to call on Dr. Nassan to go first. Georges, take it away.
Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be here. I am a neurologist trained in behavioral neurology, and at Mount Sinai, I'm also the medical director for the Center for Cognitive Health. And Alzheimer's disease is one of the main conditions that we treat at our center. Just a very quick introduction about what it is. Some of you may know already that it hits a lot of people in our population. More than 6 million Americans are living today, with Alzheimer's disease, and it is thought that by 2050, this number will probably increase to nearly 13 million. Alzheimer's disease is a type of illness that causes dementia. I'm often asked, what's the difference between the two? Dementia is a term that means that you have a condition that causes brain cells to die as time goes by, and there are many different types of it, or many different illnesses that can cause it, and one of them is Alzheimer's disease. Alzheimer's disease, at its heart, is the presence of chemicals in the brain that we call protein that misfold on themselves and accumulate in brain cells, and the major 2 ones are amyloid and tau proteins. And we don't know that this is the cause of the disease, but it is associated with it. And when this happens, and depending on where in the brain it happened, people can end up having either progressive memory loss as time goes by, progressive visual problems as time goes by, and for some people it's progressive language problem or progressive motor problems. There are other illnesses that can present in a very similar way to Alzheimer's disease, and therefore it is extremely important for clinicians to be able to spend a large amount of time with their patient in order to identify what they think is the underlying cause, because that will help with treatment and with counseling and all of that stuff. We do live in a day and age where we have a lot of tools at our disposal to help diagnose and confirm Alzheimer's disease in our patients. I'm going to let my colleague, Dr. Pereira, talk more about biomarkers and how we can utilize them to identify the disease as people are still alive. And often people ask me about the genetics in Alzheimer's disease. About 25% of people with Alzheimer's disease have a familial predisposition where they may inherit a risk factor that predisposes them to a higher likelihood than the population of getting it, but that's not causative. There's less than 1% of all cases worldwide that are caused by a particular gene that if you carry the gene, then you have the disease. So this is pretty rare. And I just want to spend a minute talking about how important it is to spend a lot of time with our patients to diagnose this. It's a disease that currently primarily is diagnosed by talking with our patients, getting really great history from their family about how the symptoms came about, how they progressed over time, what parts of the brain they're affecting, but also doing it pen and paper or sort of oral tests with our patients to understand what is going on. And that can really sometimes take 2 or 3 hours of our times. And often, we end up changing diagnoses that were given by other neurologists, that may not have been totally accurate. So with that, I'm going to turn it to the scientists, to tell us more about this disease.
Thanks very much, George. Anna, let's turn to you. This is Dr. Anna Pereira. Please tell us what you're doing at Mount Sinai.
Thanks so much for the introduction and for the invitation. So I'm a physician scientist here at Mount Sinai. So I'm a cognitive neurologist, just like George, Dr. Nassan. I see patients at the Center for Cognitive Health. And I also have a laboratory studying the neurobiology of Alzheimer's disease to be able to try to develop novel treatments and the translation of research by understanding the biology better. I think it's critical to highlight, as my colleague Dr. Nassan mentioned, that Alzheimer's disease it's truly a devastating disorder. It usually starts with memory loss, but slowly and progressively it affects most aspects of cognition, all those key abilities that make us who we are as human beings, our emotions, our thinking, our planning, our language. So it really affects our identity as unique human beings. So, and there's no disease-modifying therapy. So that's why we need to really focus our research on developing novel therapy for this devastating disorder. I'd like to highlight a little bit about what the field has progressed in the last 10 years. And I think one important aspect of this is biomarkers. So I think the last 10 years we have developed really important biomarkers, including for ligands for PET scan for amyloid and tau, those two neuropathological hallmarks that Dr. Nassan mentioned, are FDA approved and available for use, as well as high resolution brain MRIs and fluid, cerebrospinal fluid. You can also measure amyloid and tau and phospho-tau, which is toxic for the brain. And I think more recently, the data is coming from the last couple of years that we're going to soon have FDA approved, probably in the next few years, blood biomarkers. And that's really exciting, for better, easier access for patients in clinic. And I think most transformatively for clinical trials, because this is going to allow us to screen patients much faster in a much less expensive way. And increase the efficiency of trials, and as we really need to diagnose these patients very accurately for the correct target engagement, and then select a few of those cases to go for the PET scans. They are more precise and give neuroanatomical localization for readouts in clinical trials. So that's going to help us a lot in terms of efficiency for clinical trials going forward. Another few developments, knowledge that we learned in the last few years has come from the autosomal dominant Alzheimer's disease in patients that is less than 1%, but it could follow up these patients longitudinally and understand the temporal and spatial progression of the disease. And we know that amyloid accumulates in the brain 15 years before any symptom onset. And then 7 to 10 years before, we have hypometabolism, meaning those neurons are dysfunctional. And 5 to 10 years before, you have some structural atrophy, meaning shrinking of the brain. And it's really when the tau PET turns positive, really near symptom onset. So I'm mentioning this to emphasize that we really need to diagnose this disease early on to be able to treat it early on. So we have made a lot of progress in the last 10 years in terms of biomarkers. Now, what we need going forward for the next 5 to 10 years is to develop efficacious treatments. And there's a lot of going on in many laboratories. And maybe later, Dr. Nessler is going to allow me to talk a little bit about what we've been doing in our lab in terms of drug development and novel therapies. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. And when you use the word biomarker, what I take that to mean is simply a diagnostic test. When a person goes to a doctor to find out what disease they have, the doctor runs diagnostic tests. We've been in a situation with Alzheimer's disease for many decades, not knowing whether a person has such an illness until after they pass away, and then we can examine their brain on autopsy. Biomarkers are simply diagnostic tests that we could do, either brain imaging, looking at cerebral spinal fluid, spinal taps, or blood, as you mentioned, to make a diagnosis. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Thanks for clarifying.
Okay, fantastic. So let's move on to Dr. Tawfiq Raj. Tawfiq, go ahead.
Thank you, Eric. And I'm really delighted to be here and join you all. So thank you again. So I'm going to start, and I'm a computational biologist and a human geneticist. So I use big data sciences to look at genetic mechanisms underlying Alzheimer's disease. So what I'm going to start today is just to give you an update of the genetic basis for Alzheimer's disease and our use of artificial intelligence to really identify novel drug targets and biomarkers. So, as you all know, there's no single cause for Alzheimer's disease. It likely develops from multiple factors such as lifestyle, genetics, and environment. And in recent years, there have been tremendous progress made in our understanding of genetics of late onset Alzheimer's disease. As Dr. Nassan said, there's early onset, and there are Mendelian form of Alzheimer's, and there's a late onset of Alzheimer's disease. So in the last decade or so, there's been tremendous progress in identifying genes that are responsible for late onset Alzheimer's disease. So using an approach called genome-wide association studies, a national group of scientists, including many at Mount Sinai, have discovered over 70 genes through this GWAS approach, which allows you to look for differences in our genetic code, the DNA, in comparing people with Alzheimer's disease and without Alzheimer's disease. And using this approach, we found over 70 genes, sort of genomic regions that are associated with individuals' risk for Alzheimer's disease. This is really exciting progress for the field, and we've learned tremendously over the years. And of course, the most common genes is the ApoE genes, but in addition, we've identified several other novel genes. Well, these genetic studies have really have been successful, but we still don't really know the function of these genes and where they're turned on, which cell types, which tissues they're active, and their underlying link to Alzheimer's disease. So in parallel, there's been enormous effort by group scientists around the world, including folks at Mount Sinai, a lot generating data from peripheral bloods, looking at cells from individuals with Alzheimer's disease, as well as looking at tissues from autopsied brains in thousands of patients. And by looking at these data, poses a new challenge, right? Because there's a lot of data we're generating. So we're turning to machine learning, artificial intelligence approaches to really look for hidden patterns in this data. So one of the things that we've been involved in our group and Mount Sinai, in collaboration with many colleagues here, is to mine these data by applying machine learning techniques to find hidden patterns. And I think one of the exciting findings by looking at genetics and machine learning is that we found that many of these genes, sort of our key drivers of Alzheimer's disease, are turned on in these immune cells in the brain called microglia. And microglia are immune cells of the brain. They're involved in responding to infection and are involved in clearing out debris in the brain. And they form about 50% of the glial cells in the brain, the other 50% of the cells in the brain being the nerve cell. So I think this is really an exciting sort of surprising finding in the field. And it gives us opportunities to where we identified novel therapeutic targets targeting the immune system. These are non-amyloid drug targets. So I think there's several different therapeutic targets now that academia and private sectors, pharmaceutical companies, are now collaborating to do further work on drug discovery. And in parallel, given that this is immune cells, you can find these in blood. So these genes are also active or turned on in the blood. So we've been taking an approach by looking at blood profiles for individuals with Alzheimer's, without Alzheimer's, in collaboration with many of the neurologists at Mount Sinai, Dr. Pereira and Dr. Nassan, to profile these immune cells, so look at their activity and to be able to identify novel biomarkers, novel immune biomarkers, so we can hope to find biomarkers that would be predictive of the disease before the symptoms occur. So I think these are the two really exciting findings using a big data approach, combining human genetics. And I hope that these will deliver some innovative solutions that will help real patients soon.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tawfiq. Next up is Dr. Dongming Cai. Dongming, I'll ask you to tell us about your work, please.
Thank you, Eric. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to join today's webinar. I'm a physician scientist as well. I see patients at Bronx VA Hospital that affiliate with Mount Sinai and run a research program to study Alzheimer's disease, traumatic brain injury, and other neurodegenerative disorders. While my colleagues have discussed about clinical manifestations, biomarker and genetic studies of Alzheimer's disease, I'm going to talk about drug development. So currently there are 5 FDA-approved medicines for symptomatic relief. However, there is no treatment available to slow the progression or stop the development of Alzheimer's disease. Nearly all disease-modifying therapies tested today have failed to show dramatic clinical improvement. The major challenge is due to lack of clarity about disease mechanisms. A combination of genomic and genetic analysis, as well as big data mining approaches, leads to a better understanding of disease mechanisms. And this advancement have shaped our current effort surrounding the drug discovery and the clinical trial development. As of today, there are about 17 disease-modifying therapies in phase 3 clinical trial that target not only amyloid, but also many other pathways such as tau, lipid metabolisms, and inflammation. This shift in the drug development paradigm are based on studies identifying several novel risk factors involved in these pathways. My research program focuses on developing novel disease-modifying therapy for Alzheimer's disease. We have gathered an interdisciplinary team at Mount Sinai with expertise in big data mining, drug discovery, assay development, and preclinical disease modeling for this effort. There are several innovative approaches we have undertaken. First, we search for novel small molecules that target at multiple aspects of disease processes at the same time, like one drug for many disease processes, including amyloid and tau, as well as lipid pathways and inflammation. Secondly, our medicinal chemistry expertise on the team allows us to optimize our drug candidates so that they can be administered orally and got into brain easily with minimal side effect. Thirdly, our drug development for Alzheimer's disease has potential implications for other neurological disease, such as cognitive impairment associated with traumatic brain injury. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Fantastic, Dongming. So let me now turn back to Dr. Pereira. Anna, you gave us a teaser saying that your lab is also interested in looking at new treatments for Alzheimer's disease. What approaches are you taking?
Thanks, Eric. So we are very interested to understand mechanistically why the neurons that use glutamate, which is a chemical in the brain as a neurotransmitter, are mostly vulnerable to dying Alzheimer's disease. So we've been working a lot with the bioinformatics department here at Mount Sinai, which is a world-leading bioinformatics department, to identify key drivers of disease. We have also done some work on repurposing the glutamate modulator riluzole for mild Alzheimer's disease. So our lab has done a lot of preclinical work showing, if anyone is interested, I can go in more details later, but showing that it can recover many molecules related to aging Alzheimer's disease, in particular neuroplasticity, transmission and neuroinflammation that is dysfunctional in Alzheimer's disease, and prevents age-related cognitive decline in rodent models. And as a physician scientist, I wanted to translate this into patients. We run a pilot clinical trial. It's a small trial with 42 subjects, but we saw that the group that received riluzole had less decline in cerebral metabolism than the placebo group. And that correlates with cognitive performance as well. Mm-hmm. So I think that was interesting, and that made us plan now phase 3 trials. Mm-hmm. Just to mention as well, as Dominic mentioned, APOE4 is a major genetic risk factor for late onset Alzheimer's disease. And we have identified in our lab as another therapeutic avenue, a potential novel partner for APOE4 that drives that tau, the toxic tau in the brain. So we're also working with the drug discovery program to initiate potential develop monoclonal antibody to target this interaction as novel treatments. I just wanted to emphasize as well that sleep is a major interest as well from my lab and many others, because I think there's growing evidence there's a bidirectional relationship between sleep and neurodegeneration, and meaning that Alzheimer's sleep disturbances increase risk for Alzheimer's disease, and on the other hand, Alzheimer's disease also affects sleep, forming a cycle. So how can we intervene in this cycle? And many of those therapies are available already, for example, for sleep apnea patients who have an increased risk for development and progression for Alzheimer's disease. And finally, we have an interest in the heterogeneity of the disease. I think for us clinicians who see patients in clinics, some of them present with very similar symptoms in terms of memory loss, and even having, for example, I have some patients have amyloid positive and come with memory loss, others the same, but some progress very slowly for many, many years. Others progress very fast. So what makes some patients be fast, others slow, and identify the molecular drivers of that to be able to also advance novel therapies on this. Thank you, Eric.
Thanks, Anna. So the molecule you mentioned is riluzole, and that's approved by the FDA for other conditions?
Correct. It's currently FDA approved for ALS, which is Lou Gehrig's disease,
right,
which is another neurodegenerative disorder that mostly affects motor symptoms. And since it was already in the market, we wanted to potentially translate in a faster, more efficient way to see its potential efficacy in Alzheimer's disease. So I think we got interesting preliminary preclinical data that made us move to a pilot trial and then to move to a phase 3 trial. But I just want to give some words of caution. This is still preliminary. We still need to advance into a phase 3 trial. So I would not encourage anyone to prescribe it off-label outside a clinical trial until we have more evidence for both safety and efficacy. But preliminary data from our phase 2 trial was promising enough to advance to a phase 3 trial.
Yeah, no, so that's very exciting. Thank you. So let's stay on the theme of treatment. And we know that over the last decade, there have been many disappointing results with antibodies directed against the protein amyloid. But now there are still 2 antibodies that are in current trials. They're long names, and I wrote them down: aducanumab and donanemab. And what do we think about the likelihood that they'll be more positive when those clinical trials read out, which we expect in the next few months? George, maybe you could comment on what we expect?
Sure, I can take a stab, and I'd also be interested in hearing Dr. Pereira's opinion on this. I think, in general, a lot of these molecules over the past decade or so, have been very effective at clearing the amyloid protein from the brain, and we are able to see that with imaging of the protein and so on and so forth. But that hasn't translated yet really well to actual functional treatment where the patients actually feel better or they regain, function better. The 2 proteins that you mentioned, one of them is currently being reviewed by the FDA. I think they have a decision that might be coming up in June. Like many other proteins, there was a lot of promising data behind it, but there isn't enough to or yet, to show that it has made an effect on the function for patients. The other molecules, it's currently still under investigation, and I'd be really curious to see what the data is going to look like, once the clinical trial has completed recruiting and sort of maybe analyzing. And Dr. Pereira might have some other also pearls to add to that.
Okay, and certainly one of the things that we heard from Dr. Pereira earlier is that the deposition of amyloid and other proteins like tau can begin more than a decade before a person develops symptoms, which really underscores the importance of these early diagnostic approaches that you've all talked about, these so-called biomarkers. So today, if I were concerned that I were having memory problems, what should I use as basically the trigger point for me to get tested? I mean, what would you advise me? And then also, what would be the tests that you would recommend me get to determine if I might have Alzheimer's disease or another dementing illness?
That's a great question, Eric, and thank you. I think any person who has concerns, or symptoms, or is feeling, even if it's something like totally mild and they're not sure what's going on, should first talk to their doctor about it and maybe see a neurologist accordingly, after doing some preliminary evaluation. Sometimes people have things that are easy to treat that reverses their memory problems, like their lack of sleep, or anxiety, especially in this year that we all have been through. I think there's been a lot going on that isn't necessarily degenerative, but certainly could be a risk factor if not treated or if not caught early. But certainly, I think an evaluation with a neurologist is always a good place to start in order to get down to the nitty-gritty details of what type of memory problem is it, what exactly is it that you have difficulty learning new information, or you learn them, but then you don't retain them, or you retain them, but then you need cues to get them later. And all these are different types of memory problems that could point to different causes. And certainly for those, and I saw a question also from the audience that are looking for just preventing, some of these things, I think that there has been some risk factors that are pretty well understood, and they are very similar to cardiac disease risk factors. So people with diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, smoking, should treat all of that, or stop smoking, stop drinking alcohol. Exercising is really good and has been linked to decreasing the likelihood, of people developing these illnesses. There has been some literature on diet, like the Mediterranean diet, healthy diet that includes vegetable, fruits, and avoid fried food, that has been beneficial. And people have looked at a lot of supplements and vitamins with variable and sort of conflicting evidence. So unclear, maybe there is a role for them, but it's still pretty unclear.
Okay, maybe we could come back to that, because I know there are several audience questions related to that. But right now, if I wanted to know if I had amyloid being deposited in my brain, I'd get an amyloid PET scan, right, Dongming? Maybe you could tell us about the scans that are available for people today.
Right, so there are amyloid PET scan available for patient. Usually, Medicare, I think, covers for the diagnosis have questionable of dementia, not necessarily that we kind of know for sure is an Alzheimer diagnosis in that case. There's also PET scan imaging available for tau imaging that is currently also become available soon. As Anna mentioned already, several other biomarkers has still in the testing pipeline, like for neuroinflammations or synaptic plasticities, and then plasma biomarker will soon become available as well.
Right, so we could foresee a point where being screened for Alzheimer's disease or another dementia might be part of normal surveillance starting at age 40 or so, 40, 45, 50. And then similar to our management of high cholesterol, we might be started on the equivalent of a statin drug, but not to lower cholesterol, but a different drug to limit the pathology of Alzheimer's disease, since this pathology seems to be something that evolves in the brain over several decades. So that is the current thinking as we begin to approach what these treatments will look like.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
absolutely. Yeah, I think this is
Yeah, go ahead, Anna.
That's a very interesting point. Now we have biomarkers. If you want to know if you have amyloid in your brain, you have amyloid PET scan. We have CSF biomarkers. You can get spinal fluid, and you can get tau PET scans. And probably in the next few years, we're going to have blood. You can just go to the office and get a blood test. I think the key thing is going to be to advance therapies so that we can treat them early on. And I really like your analogy to cardiovascular disease. That's, if there are multiple treatments, the aspirin for platelets, the blood pressure, the cholesterol, we may end up with a little cocktail of medications targeting different pathways in Alzheimer's disease. I think it's critical that you understand what are the upstreams, what are the key drivers of disease so that you can target it the best way possible.
Right, thank you. And so Tawfiq, we were talking earlier about the fact that dementias are highly heterogeneous. Even Alzheimer's disease is presumably heterogeneous. Many disease processes contribute to what we're today calling one thing, Alzheimer's disease. We hope that genetics and some of the biomarker efforts that you're looking at will help us define that heterogeneity. Tell us a little bit more about the distinction between what several of you raised of familial Alzheimer's disease, these few genes that are very rare, that if you have them, pretty much will mean you get Alzheimer's disease at an early age, versus more general risk factors that we may carry in our genetic composition, tens of them or even more, that might put us over the edge of being at higher risk or lower risk. Can you say a bit more about this?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think there's two, as Eric said, there's two. There's a Mendelian form of Alzheimer's disease where you have one or few.
So people won't know what Mendelian means.
Sort of the familial form, right? So the disease versus late onset, when you're in your age is the most common risk factors for the late onset disease, where age of 60 or more. So I think genetics have really helped in understanding the complexity of these genes. We're finding it's not just one or two genes, right? It's probably hundreds of these genes that are leading to, each have a weak effect, but together they explain a lot of the genetic, sort of risk for the disease. So the familial disease, and we know that ApoE, the E4 that Dr. Pereira talked about, but in addition, the recent work that as a group of scientists, we've identified many small sort of effects that throughout our genome, right? So that are involved in risk for the late onset Alzheimer's disease. So I think, and they are involved in multiple different pathways. What I mean by pathway here, again, they're involved in different function within the cell, immunoinflammation, they could be involved in sort of in protein aggregation, how the proteins are recycled in the brain. So I think we're learning a lot about it, and especially using these big data approaches, right? We can start looking at subtypes, let the data drive, and we're incorporating imaging data, right? Blood data sets that are coming from patients that were collected here at Mount Sinai. And we're learning just by applying these big data techniques, we can figure out the different sort of subtypes that can tell us more about the heterogeneity, the different subtypes of Alzheimer's. And in a recent study that one of the colleagues here at Mount Sinai have shown there's multiple different subtypes of this disease. So I think that, with the recent advances, we're learning that it's much more complex than we thought. But I think that the significant progress have been made in our understanding of the sort of the later onset of the disease. Yeah.
And in fields like cardiovascular medicine or cancer, doctors are now obtaining genome sequences from people and using what are called polygenic risk scores, putting together hundreds of genes, just as you mentioned, and defining whether an individual is at risk for an illness, but in particular, what biochemical pathway is involved in their version of the disease, which would then guide treatment. So one might imagine within a few years from now, a person would get a blood test that would define what type of dementia or Alzheimer's disease that might have and point them toward one treatment or another. An amyloid antibody really is all if it proves to be effective, or something else.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think that, as you said, polygenic risk score has been a really exciting area of development in human genetics. allows us to sort of aggregate looking at the genetic risk for each individual. So we can sum up and assign the score that tells us how the genetic, risk for each individual. I think combining that with blood-based biomarkers, and I think that, in the next few years, I think we're very, very close to being able to use that as a utility in the clinic.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So let's turn now to audience questions. We've already gotten quite a few. Please feel free to put additional questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screens. Dongming, let me start with you. There were a few questions about the relationship between traumatic brain injury and Alzheimer's disease. And you mentioned that this is part of your lab's interests as well. What is the relationship between the two? Does TBI, traumatic brain injury, increase someone's risk for Alzheimer's disease, for example? Do they share certain pathological processes and so on?
Thank you, Eric. That's a very good question. So I think, in the past 20, 30 years or so, research actually has linked at least moderate and severe TBI to a greater risk of developing Alzheimer's disease or other type of dementia. For example, one of the studies showed that older adults with a history of moderate TBI would have like about 2 to 3 times greater risk of developing Alzheimer's than the subject that has no history of head trauma at all. And then, however, there's not very clear evidence about a single mild traumatic brain injury increases the dementia risk. On the other hand, data suggests that repetitive mild TBIs, like often we get exposed through sports, that may link to a greater risk of developing a type of dementia we call chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE abbreviation. So, yeah.
So in the context of traumatic brain injury, if a person sustains a brain injury, a sports injury or otherwise, and they get an amyloid scan, is there evidence of amyloid being deposited in their brains as a result of the brain trauma?
Well, the association with amyloid to the traumatic brain injury exposure more on the acute phase, then relate to the sense of the dementia development with TBI exposure are relatively controversial. On the other hand, the tau pathology or tau-related neurodegeneration processes are highly linked or highly associated with the traumatic brain injury associated neurodegeneration.
So the amyloid is more acute around the injury, and the tau might be the more important pathogenic mechanism that accumulates over time.
Correct.
In chronic traumatic encephalopathy.
Right.
Or
so still a lot of study need to be done at this point.
Yeah. Okay.
So they're still considered in the tauopathy group, right? So they are.
Yeah. Go ahead, Anna.
They accumulate tau in the brain, both CTE and Alzheimer's, different location, but a tau is a common mechanism of injury, potentially.
So if I had a teenage child who sustained a sports injury, head trauma, or a young adult in a ski injury or something like that, a sustained head trauma, what is the best advice for them to reduce subsequent risk of developing Alzheimer's disease many decades later? Is there anything that they could do?
Duration, frequency, all this matters a lot.
Okay, so one concussion is not so bad. Okay, thanks. Let me address another question about what it's like these days going to the doctor to seek help for Alzheimer's disease or another type of dementia. George, let me call on you. Perhaps you could tell us about the experience that we like our patients at Mount Sinai to have. In particular, the importance of bringing together people representing many different fields.
Absolutely. Thank you, Eric. So we have actually at Mount Sinai been working very actively to try and bring under one roof the disciplines of geriatrics, psychiatry, neurology, and neuropsychology, as well as social worker and other sort of services. We think that it takes a village to take care of people with Alzheimer's disease and dementia, but also with other cognitive problems or other types of dementia. And we want to make sure that we we have a whole sort of team working together on sort of doing that. This is currently in development. We were very lucky to have a grant from a very grateful patient and donor that allowed us to sort of start this project. We are currently in the process of hiring new people, including a nurse and sort of other personnel, and piloting this internally with a few of our patients, and then hopefully start opening up this clinic, to the public. I'm really very excited about it, and I think it's going to change the way that we care for people who have Alzheimer's disease, which is really great. And I also want to address, I think, wrapped into this, a question from the audience about a prevention clinic, which is also a piece of this project, where in addition to providing services for people with symptoms, diagnosing them and sort of like following them and making sure they have a team to take care of them, we also want to be able to care for people who just may be worried or anxious, or maybe have a family history or what have you, and be able to counsel them accordingly. So we have an arm of this project that's going to be geared towards taking care of individuals with no symptoms, but who are looking for just counseling and sort of advice on this.
Excellent. So the clinic that you're referring to is the Dean Center for Brain Health.
Correct.
So this is one place where an individual can go who is interested in optimizing their cognitive functioning, or if they're concerned about early cognitive loss and in slowing that progression.
Absolutely. And really, it is we want to do the work, and we don't want the patient to have to figure the system out. So really, we're starting this clinic so that whoever has a symptom, can just come to us, and we can then let them know, oh, let's have a geriatrician see you, or let's have a psychiatrist see you, or let's have a neurologist, depending on what we think, is the best fit. So, and that way we
go to one place and you decide what the
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Excellent. All right, and let's talk about prevention, or the role of other things in our lives as they relate to Alzheimer's disease. These have already come up, and several of you in the audience have asked questions about them: diet, the gut microbiome, sleep, exercise, exercising the brain as well. Who wants to take on answering that first? Maybe, George, you're the best person, if I could go back.
Sure. Yeah, would be happy to. So there are medical risk factors, which I think we mentioned briefly before, but there are chronic medical conditions that are risk factors for Alzheimer's disease, like diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and these will be important to
just getting those three under control. Better control of diabetes, blood pressure, and cholesterol can help reduce the progression of Alzheimer's disease.
Correct, and the risk of just developing Alzheimer's disease, from the get-go. And then physical exercise, which in the literature, it's, I think the current sort of accepted type of exercise is cardio exercise for about 150 minutes per week, and divided in however ways that people like. But that is what we mean when we say exercise. At least 150 minutes a week of cardio type exercise. Healthy diet, which is loosely defined, but based on what we call the Mediterranean diet. Good sleep hygiene, and this is a tough one for a lot of people, but a good sleep hygiene is really important and key, including controlling risk factor like sleep apnea, which is a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease as well. Like I mentioned earlier, there has been a lot of back and forth about whether there are vitamins or supplements that could help. To this date, nothing really has been very rigorously proven to scientifically, be able to modify the biology of the disease. But, it could be that we're not measuring it correctly, or it could be that they really don't work. But so far, we don't really have any supplement to offer people.
Mm-hmm. And just to add on what Eric mentioned before, social stimulation and keeping socially and cognitively stimulated are also very important. And
absolutely,
as we're seeing with this pandemic, the social isolation, we're seeing our patients' direct impact in their cognition. Just to add to what George mentioned.
No, so that's really crucial, because during this time of lockdowns over the past 13 or so months, elderly people at risk for Alzheimer's disease or with early signs of the illness, the social isolation that they had in many cases made their symptoms much, much worse. So social stimulation is obviously very important. What can we offer people in terms of advice around sleep? Telling people to sleep better, may not help so much. So what can a person do to really improve their sleep? Because since we know that it's so important.
Maybe I'll start off by the sleep apnea that George was mentioning. I think it's really important to emphasize that sleep apnea in the elderly is much more common than we think and underdiagnosed. So, it's unlike in young patients, many of them are not obese and do not snore at night. It doesn't mean like you are not snoring, doesn't mean you don't have sleep apnea. And this is something you can test out doing a testing a polysomnography that can be done either home or in the lab. And the sleep apnea has two aspects to it. It's sleep fragmentation, meaning you wake up several times during the night. And second is hypoxia or apnea. So that means low oxygenation goes to the brain. And both of those phenomena have been associated with increased accumulation of amyloid and tau and increased risk of progression for Alzheimer's disease. And this has been established in large epidemiological studies with hundreds of patients. So if you have sleep apnea, maybe test it out. And if you do, there's treatment for that to prevent and improve that. And the other thing that George was mentioning was sleep hygiene, right? Make sure that you have a schedule.
So tell me what sleep hygiene even means. I think of hygiene as washing my hands.
Yeah, no, I think this is for all of us, right? Especially for us who have children too. It's like, don't go to the screen just before going to bed because there's a lot of visual stimulation. Avoid caffeine and drinking late at night. Mm-hmm. Having a schedule that you sleep in a number of hours matters, right? Sleeping a good number of hours per night and try to not have disruption during your sleep. So all those things are very important. And treat sleep apnea if you do have so.
Right. So those are all really good recommendations. And if all else fails, does it make sense to take a pill that helps us sleep, a medication?
I'm actually really thankful you asked this, Eric, because I was going to get to that. Sleep medications can be pretty detrimental for the brain. And I think this is often overlooked by many, including, some doctors. And I think that at the Center for Cognitive Health, we often see patients that started on this pill or that pill. And many of the pills that help you sleep, essentially, the reason you're sleeping is they are shutting down your brain. I mean, they are decreasing your cell activity. And some of them, not all of them, but some of them could be pretty detrimental and have side effects of cognitive and memory problems.
So you're saying that we really shouldn't rush to take a sleeping pill, that we should work on all these other things that you're talking
Absolutely.
about first.
Absolutely. And if you need to take something, talk to your doctor first, and try to figure that out with them. And I mean, the good news, and I know this doesn't sound very scientific, but if you Google sleep hygiene, all the documents say the same thing, and they're all pretty good, and they have a list of different things that people can do to improve their sleep and minimize sort of insomnia and awakening in the middle of the night, so on and so forth.
And someone just wrote in, how many times waking up in the middle of the night is bad? Like, is waking up every 4 hours bad or every 2 or 3 hours bad? I mean, when would you say it's a problem?
A sleep cycle is about 90 minutes. And even if you're waking up between sleep cycles, but then going back to sleep and getting... As long as
you could go back to sleep, it's okay.
Exactly, yeah.
Dongming, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I want to point out that also that mental health is important to recognize as well, just because I do think that sleep, sometimes disrupted sleep can be a symbols or symptoms of depression to be recognized and then treated as well to help the sleep.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Okay, so Tawfiq, let me turn back to you and ask you, you had mentioned something about the role of the immune system in Alzheimer's disease or other dementias, and the surprise result that you and your colleagues obtained, that when you looked at brain changes, a lot of them pointed to cells that are not even nerve cells, that these are immune cells that are present in every brain. It's low levels, that where the genetics is really pointing some of the activity in terms of dementia pathology. What do you think that the immune system has to do with Alzheimer's disease? I mean, how do you make sense of the implication of the immune role in dementia?
Yeah, that's a great question, Eric. I think for years, people thought this is sort of the consequences of the disease, right? You have Alzheimer's, then you have the immune activation. But we think because genetics is telling many of these genes, we think there's a causal basis to the importance of the immune system, right? So these are causal change, not just consequences. You have plaques and buildup. It's not just you have a neuroinflammation, although that could also happen. But I think what genetics is telling us, there's these genes that are sort of involved in sort of, we think they're involved in clearing out, right, of debris that are found, like clearing out of A beta and these protein aggregates that are found in the brain. This is a really cutting edge, an ongoing area of study. We don't know whether it's protective, whether the immune system is protective or a risk for Alzheimer's disease, which is really an interesting question that many groups at Mount Sinai are really focusing on by looking at both animal models as well as human patients from autopsied individuals. So I think there's still an ongoing area of work right now to figure out how does the immune system, whether it's protective role for the disease or with the risk. And I saw some questions about infection. I think that comes up a lot. Like, there's been, I just want to say,
just so the rest of the audience knows, some of the audience members have asked about COVID infection or even HIV or other types of infection. Please go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think, I don't look at infection models in Alzheimer's, but I just have to say there's several studies in the recent year have pointed to some infection, either HIV or herpes virus, or, I don't know if there's enough data for COVID, but I think those are correlated, right, studies. We haven't really established or there's causal for Alzheimer's disease. So I'm still skeptical about these studies because there are contradictory results from 3 different publications. So I have to say that we're still not sure if there's a infection is causing the disease. And I have to say these are mostly correlated. I mean, we see an increased association with individuals that have Alzheimer's, herpes virus, for example. And then some studies show quite the opposite. So I think we have to be a little careful in interpreting these results. I think these are mostly correlated. And I mean, others can add on to it if one, but I think, yeah.
And based on our understanding of the contribution of the immune system to many other organ diseases, cardiovascular disease and others, we need just the right amount of immune response. Too little or too much can be deleterious.
Exactly.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just to follow up on infections, as a clinician, at least from the clinical standpoint, it is a contributor in many ways. For example, even if a patient has Alzheimer's or any dementia, if you have a UTI, a urinary tract infection, look, it's not even in your sexual, it can worsen the symptoms, right? And HIV, we know patients who do not have levels, they are under stable levels that are too high, those patients can develop dementia and cognitive symptoms. I think COVID is too early to say, but I think we are emerging, it's still anecdotal at this point, but patients that may have been having emerging neurodegenerative disorders, but they're becoming much more prominent, the symptoms now after COVID, and some cognitive symptoms that we at Mount Sinai have a very large cohort of patients who are being followed longitudinally. So we're going to start to understand a lot more what is the impact of COVID in cognition and risk to develop Alzheimer's disease later on.
Mm-hmm. One of the questions that was just asked is the relationship between depression and Alzheimer's disease, which I think is quite important. Would one of you like to comment on that? George, maybe as...
Sure, yeah, and let me start. This is such an important question. I want to start by saying that sometimes, if not many times, depression can be the first presenting symptom of Alzheimer's disease. I mean, I think we often think of cognition as being the problem, but in many people, the neuropsychiatric symptoms are the presenting symptoms of these illnesses. People can start with anxiety or depression or mood problems, and only years later start having memory problems. And I think as a clinical body, we learn to be more in tune with these complaints and sort of not take them lightly or take them for granted, and really try to dig deep to be able to find this earlier. That being said, I mean, I think that people with long-standing psychiatric illnesses like depression or other mood disorders could be at a higher risk of brain conditions. Not necessarily Alzheimer's disease. There are other types of degenerative illnesses, you know, that could be sort of the end presenting sort of clinical syndrome of a long-standing psychiatric illness that we can look at. But certainly there's a relationship between mood, depression, behavior, and cognition. And, you know, just as a reminder, all of these are the brain. Everything we are is our brain. You know, we don't love with our hearts, we love with our brain, so on and so forth. So it's really all up here.
That's right. I always say that when a person uses I heart somebody, there really should be a brain there instead of a heart.
Absolutely.
All behavior comes from the brain. So
okay, excellent. Thank you. So it really argues for the importance of bringing to bear a neurologist, psychiatrist, psychologist, social worker to these individuals so that they could get care along many dimensions of brain health, including depression, cognition, and so on. We're coming to the close of the hour, and we just got a very interesting question from an audience member. I'm going to turn back to Dongming Kai about animal models. The question is whether, you know, to what extent can we develop a mouse, for example, that shows signs of Alzheimer's disease? What are your thoughts about that? I know your lab has been very active in working in this area.
Yeah, that's a very complex question. So coming to modeling of Alzheimer's disease. So, I mean, we have a lot of animal models now, you know, basically developed for Alzheimer's disease, not just for study the mechanisms, also understand the drug and using for drug discovery development pipelines. Some of these animal models have been used for years. They basically carry the mutations that we saw in the familial Alzheimer's disease patient. And then in those mice model, actually, we do see, you know, the pathology changes we see in the human brains, like amyloid depositions, and then cognitive function impairment that mimicking we see in Alzheimer's disease processes. So in certain degree, it's a reasonable tool for us to study, although there are limitations. After all, they are, you know, mouse models, as we can see that a lot of clinical trials tend to cure the mouse, but end up fail the human study eventually. So there are a lot of progress currently, right, trying to develop a better model, you know, a better model more representing the disease mechanisms or the complexity of the disease mechanisms. And then also take into consideration of other possible modeling, like human iPSC cells, like, you know, human cells that can derive in the petri dish, like a culture.
Basically taking a skin sample and
Right.
inducing a stem cell, and then
Right.
in turn a nerve cell or an immune cell or something else, and studying the pathology.
Correct.
Great.
So yeah, those are the cells directly come from Alzheimer's disease patient or, you know, controls that really mimicking exactly what's going on in this patient per se in their brain cells. So that's another addition to this good model.
Yeah, and certainly with respect to every medical illness, it's hard to think of an advance made in medicine that has not relied in some part on animal models. Well, listen, so we have come to the end of this program. I want to thank you all for joining us again. I particularly want to thank our 4 panelists. It was very nice having this conversation with you all. Thank you. And I wanted to emphasize the degree to which all of the advances that you've heard about today rely on philanthropy. So we're going to show the flow code again on the screen. If you point your smartphone camera to it, it should direct you to the internet, and we would be very grateful of any support that you could give us to help sustain these very important efforts. Thank you all very much. Stay safe and please join us for our next Friedman Brain Institute webinar. Good afternoon.